The alarms in the control room were already screaming when Nate Harper slammed his hand down on the manual override. Red lights strobed against concrete walls, turning the big stainless steel tanks outside the glass into pulsing shadows. On the other side of the locked door, fists pounded hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Open up, Harper! Step away from that panel!" a man shouted, voice muffled by 3 inches of reinforced steel. Nate didn't move. His eyes stayed on the screen in front of him. Graphs spiking red toxic levels climbing in the outgoing water lines that fed half the city. In the upper corner of the monitor, a grainy camera feed showed security guards running toward the building, and behind them the plant's executive vice president, pale and furious, barking into his phone. If Nate did nothing, families would drink that water by morning. If he shut the flow down, the entire town would be without water overnight, and the company would come for him with everything it had. His fingers shook only once as he slid the flash drive into the console, pulling up the hidden files he'd been collecting for weeks. Falsified reports, fake safety tests, quiet approvals from people who'd never set foot inside the plant. He heard another crash at the door, closer this time. Nate took a breath, saw his daughter's face in his mind. Emma, at 8 years old, hair in a messy ponytail, asking if the water was really safe to drink. And then he made his choice. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button, if you believe courage still matters in this world. Nate Harper was 37, and most days you'd never have guessed there was anything remarkable about him. By night, he was the maintenance supervisor at Clearwater Processing, a big food packaging and water handling plant on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. By day, he was just Emma's dad, the guy in the faded jacket walking his daughter to the bus stop, coffee in one hand and her oversized backpack in the other. He lived in a small rented house at the end of a cracked cul-de-sac, the kind of place where kids' bikes lay in front yards, and neighbors waved from dented lawn chairs. Inside that house, there were photos of a woman with laughing eyes on every wall, his late wife Rachel, gone 3 years now, from a sudden stroke that had hit like lightning out of a clear sky. The world had moved on. Nate hadn't, not really. Before everything fell apart, he'd been a civil engineer with a state inspection team, the guy companies hated to see coming because he didn't look the other way. After Rachel died, and the medical bills arrived faster than the condolences, he took the first job that would cover the mortgage and keep the lights on. Clearwater Processing didn't require a fancy title, just long hours, quiet competence, and no questions. He kept the machines running, the pumps humming, the filters clear. He knew every valve and pipe in that plant like the back of his hand. The executives barely knew his name. The line workers trusted him with their lives. At home, Emma saw something else entirely. She saw the dad who burned pancakes on Saturdays, who set up a telescope in the backyard when the sky was clear, who promised her that he'd always make sure their water and their world was safe. It was a promise he made to her the night Rachel died, when the hospital hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and he realized it was just the two of them now. For a while, life settled into a fragile rhythm, school work, late-night TV dinners at the kitchen table. Then one cold Tuesday in January, the rhythm shattered. A junior technician came running into the maintenance bay, face white as copy paper, waving a clipboard. "Harper," he said, voice shaking, "you need to see this. The readings on line C, they don't make sense, and they want us to sign off anyway." Nate wiped the grease from his hands, took the clipboard and saw the numbers. He felt his stomach drop. That was the moment he realized something was very wrong with the water leaving Clearwater Processing, and that someone somewhere up the chain wanted him to look the other way. Nate spent that Tuesday night pacing the narrow aisle between the filtration tanks long after the rest of the crew clocked out. Something about those numbers wouldn't leave him alone. He'd seen anomalies before, small spikes, natural variations, but this was different. This was systematic, deliberate. By morning, he'd barely slept. He dropped Emma at school, forced a smile when she waved from the sidewalk, then drove straight back to the plant with a knot tightening in his chest. Clearwater Processing was already humming with controlled chaos. Forklifts beeped, conveyor belts shuddered, and high-pressure lines thumped through walls like a heartbeat. As Nate walked toward the maintenance office, he noticed supervisors clustered in tight circles, whispering. A few glanced at him, then quickly turned away. In the break room, 2 line operators stopped talking the moment he stepped in. One nodded politely, the other stared at the table like Nate wasn't there. He tried to ignore it. He reached for the coffee pot, poured a cup, and was about to take a seat when the plant manager, Vince Kincannon, strode through the doorway with the swagger of a man who thought clipboards belonged under other people's arms. "Nate," Vince said in that forced friendly voice that always felt like a warning. "I need to see you in my office." A few workers exchanged looks. No one said a word. Nate followed him upstairs past the glass windows overlooking the production floor. Vince closed the office door behind them, then tossed a printed report across the desk. "Sign this," he said. Nate picked it up. A formal review. A notice stating that Line C had been inspected, cleared, and approved. His signature was already typed at the bottom. All he had to do was scribble over the line. "Vince." Nate said quietly, "These readings aren't normal. They're within tolerance." "No, they're not. They haven't been within tolerance for weeks." He tapped the page. This is scrubbed. These are numbers someone wants to see, not what actually came through yesterday." Vince's jaw tightened. "You're a maintenance man, Harper, not an engineer. Not anymore." The words landed like a punch. Nate felt heat rise in his face, but he swallowed it down. "I'm not signing false data." Vince leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Look, corporate is on my back about this quarter's output. We've had 2 delays already. You putting up a fight now? That's not helpful." "It's not safe," Nate said. "Whatever's in that water." "Enough," Vince snapped. He reached forward, snatched the paper back, and slid open a drawer. "If you don't sign, I'll find someone who will. Either way, this report is moving." Nate stared at him. "This could hurt people. Or it could hurt productivity," Vince said flatly. "Between the two, you only have authority over one." That was the end of the conversation. Nate walked out of the office with his pulse pounding in his ears. Downstairs, the break room fell utterly silent as he passed. Someone whispered, "Told you he was going to be a problem." He tracked down the junior technician who'd come to him the day before, Zach, barely 22 and fresh out of vocational school. "Zach," Nate said, pulling him aside. "Did anyone talk to you about the Line C readings?" Zach's throat bobbed. They asked if I'd miscalibrated anything. Did you tell them no?" Zach's voice shook. "I told them I wasn't sure." Nate's stomach dropped. The fear in the kid's eyes said everything. Someone had leaned hard enough to make him doubt his own work, or at least pretend to. When Nate tried to speak again, Zach lowered his voice. "You should be careful. They said you were asking too many questions." Who said that? Zach only shook his head, then drifted away like a leaf caught in a current he couldn't fight. All day, Nate's world shrank. Supervisors avoided him. Protocols were suddenly updated, shutting him out of access he'd had for years. His keys didn't work on rooms he'd helped build. When he asked for data logs, he was told they were under review. When he requested backup samples, he was told they'd already been disposed of. By late afternoon, Nate stood on the upper catwalk overlooking the plant floor. He watched pallets move toward the loading docks. Pallets packed with cases of bottled water and packaged meals headed to stores across the Tri-County region, all released under that falsified report. He gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles blanched. He thought of Emma at the breakfast table, swinging her legs, pouring a glass of tap water without thinking twice. He thought of the friends who drank from the same supply. He thought of Rachel, how she'd trusted him to protect their girl. He had never felt so powerless. By the time his shift ended, the sky was already dark. He wanted nothing more than to go home, eat dinner with Emma, and pretend the world was simpler than it really was. But when he stepped outside, he saw a familiar figure waiting by his truck, Kurt Breslin, the plant's senior safety officer. A broad man with a gut built from decades of cafeteria meals and a face carved into permanent disapproval. Nate Kurt said, arms crossed, "Got a minute?" Nate braced himself. "What's this about?" Kurt looked around first, then lowered his voice. "Word is you caused quite the disturbance in the manager's office today. I raised a concern. You accused the company of falsifying records. I said the numbers didn't line up. Same thing far as the front office is concerned." Nate exhaled through his nose. "Kurt, you know the readings weren't right. You've been here long enough to recognize patterns." Kurt hesitated, and for a moment Nate saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear, guilt, maybe both. "Look," Kurt said finally, "we don't get paid to rewrite policy. We get paid to keep the place running, and if the place is hurting people, that's above our pay grade." Nate stepped forward. "You're the safety officer." "And safety," Kurt said, "is defined by what the company approves." The truth of it crushed something inside Nate. This man who'd once mentored him during his first month on the job had given up fighting long ago. Kurt looked tired. "Take a word of advice. Stop digging. You've got a kid to raise. Don't make yourself a target." With that, he walked off into the darkness, leaving Nate standing alone with the uneasy feeling that he'd crossed an invisible line. When Nate finally pulled into his driveway, the porch light from his neighbor's house glowed faintly. Inside his own home, the warm smell of pasta and garlic bread drifted through the air. Emma sat at the table with homework spread out legs tucked under her like a little bird. "Daddy," she chirped when he came in. "You're late. Long day?" he said softly, setting his keys down. She told him about school, about the solar system project her class was starting, about how she wanted Saturn because she liked the rings. He listened, nodding, but his mind kept drifting back to the plant, to the false reports, to the pallets rolling out the loading docks. At one point, Emma glanced up and frowned. "Daddy, are you mad at me?" "What?" The question jolted him. "No, sweetheart. Why would you think that you're making the face you made when Mom was sick?" The sad one. His throat tightened. He reached for her hand. "I'm not mad. Just tired." She studied him a moment longer, like she didn't quite believe it, then slid her chair closer and leaned her head against his arm. The simple trust of it, her small weight, her quiet closeness cut right through him. That night after tucking her in, he sat in the dark living room with the TV off. His phone buzzed twice, missed calls from an unknown number, voicemails he didn't want to check. He knew they weren't from friends. He opened his laptop again, pulled up the digital log he'd saved years ago, a copy of the old inspection protocols he used to teach state trainees. He compared the guidelines to the data he'd seen on Line C. He didn't like what he found. The contamination wasn't a one-off. It had been creeping upward for months. The next morning at dawn, he took Emma to school. She clung to him a little longer than usual before running off to join her classmates. As she disappeared through the doors, a heavy sense of dread settled over him. Back at the plant, the air felt thicker, charged with hostility. Nate headed for the monitoring station, but two security guards stepped in front of him. "Sorry, Harper," the taller one said. "You're not cleared for the main floor today." "What management directive?" "Pending review. Review." The word cracked like a whip. Behind them, workers stared up from their stations. Some looked sympathetic. Others watched with curiosity. Some looked almost relieved that the troublemaker was being boxed out. Nate clenched his jaw. "I'm the night maintenance supervisor. I can't do my job if I can't access the equipment. Not our call." Frustration surged beneath his ribs. Not shouting, not anger, something deeper, heavier. He stepped back. Hands raised slightly. He wasn't going to give them any excuse. He went to the maintenance office instead. His toolbox was sitting outside the door, locked, tagged, sealed with a bright orange strip that read, "Under investigation." His nameplate had been removed. He stood there a long moment staring at the stripped door, feeling the pressure build behind his ribs like a slow, cold wave. Every instinct told him this was the warning before the real blow. He'd seen the looks. He'd heard the whispers. Someone somewhere up the chain wanted him silenced. Just before noon, Zach hurried down the hall toward him, eyes wide with panic. "Nate!" he whispered. "They're saying you tampered with the filtration system." Nate froze. "What they're blaming the anomaly on you. They're saying you accessed Line C without authorization. How I was the one who reported it. That's not the story going around." Nate's pulse hammered. "Who started it?" Zach swallowed. "The front office." The pressure inside Nate's chest went from tight to crushing. Someone had rewritten the script. Someone had flipped the narrative before he even knew the playbook existed. And then, like a final twist of the knife, Zach added, "They said there's going to be a formal hearing this afternoon. They might suspend you." Nate didn't respond. He couldn't. Everything inside him had gone quiet, cold, still, like the moment before a storm breaks open the sky. For the first time since he'd started at Clearwater Processing, he realized the truth. They weren't just pushing him aside. They were building a case. And when the hearing came, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't going to be a fair fight. Nate sat alone in the empty conference room, the hum of the old fluorescent lights vibrating through the walls like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock. It was already 1:45. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see supervisors gathering in the hallway, their voices low and clipped, papers pressed tightly against their chests. He felt the pressure of the moment like a hand tightening around his ribs. Every breath came shallow. Every second felt stolen. He wasn't afraid of losing the job. He was afraid of what would happen if he didn't stop what was already moving through those pipes, water tainted with something no family should ever drink. He had tried to follow protocol. He had tried to raise concerns. He had tried staying quiet, then speaking up, then keeping his head down. None of it mattered. Someone had decided he was the problem, and once the story was set, the truth stopped standing a chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, Emma's drawing from last night. She'd handed it to him before bed, proud as could be. It was a picture of the two of them standing by their little house, the sun drawn big in the corner, the grass too green to be real. He kept the page between his fingers. He remembered Rachel telling him years ago, "Our girl will grow up in a world that's safe. Promise me that, Nate." He had nodded, then not knowing how heavy that promise would one day feel. A knock hit the door. Harper. Inside. Now. The hearing room was the same conference space they used for quarterly safety presentations. Today, the chairs were arranged like a tribunal. Vince sat at the center. Beside him were 2 corporate reps sent from the regional office people Nate had never met, but who had already made up their minds. A stack of printed reports sat neatly in front of them, accusations disguised as evidence. One of the reps cleared her throat. "Mr. Harper, we've reviewed substantial documentation that suggests you accessed restricted systems without authorization. Further, several employees reported concerning behavior indicating you may have tampered with filtration controls. Nate stared at the papers. Lies carefully constructed, conveniently timed, and delivered with corporate smoothness. He sat down slowly. You know that's not true. The rep didn't blink. We're here to determine whether your conduct compromised facility safety. We are not here to discuss your feelings. The words sliced deeper than they should have. He clasped his hands together, grounding himself. Before we start, Nate said, I want access to yesterday's flow data from lines A through F. That's irrelevant, Vince snapped. It's extremely relevant, Nate replied more firmly. If you're accusing me of tampering, you need to show the output conditions for the system I allegedly touched. The reps exchanged glances. Then one said, there's no need. That data has been archived. Archived, meaning hidden, buried, maybe even erased. Nate's pulse steadied into something colder. Then bring in the live monitors. I want to see current readings. Denied. The word echoed off the walls like a door slamming shut. Nate knew then they weren't just trying to fire him. They were trying to bury him. The rep leaned forward. Mr. Harper, please answer directly. Did you alter or obstruct the filtration systems in any way? Nate opened his mouth. Then the PA system crackled overhead. All supervisors to line C. Immediate assistance required. Repeat, immediate assistance required. Every head snapped upward. Vince cursed under his breath, grabbed his tablet, and stood. Meeting adjourned until further. Before he could finish, the overhead alarm blared. A sharp, mechanical wail. Not a drill. Not a test. A real catastrophic alert. The corporate reps stiffened. What is that, one demanded. Nate didn't wait to explain. He bolted. He sprinted through the hallway, ignoring the shouts behind him, adrenaline ripping through his veins. Workers rushed past him in the opposite direction, some confused, some terrified. The automated voice spoke through the plant speaker's flat and emotionless containment breach. Line C, potential contamination release. All non-essential personnel evacuate immediately. Nate shoved through the double doors into the processing floor and stopped cold. A high-pressure pipe leading from the filtration tanks was buckling, vibrating under pressure, then cracking tiny fractures spreading like lightning through metal. A mist sprayed from the fissure, thin but steady, coating the air with a sharp chemical tang that burned the back of the throat. If that pipe ruptured fully, hundreds of gallons of untreated water would flood the floor. The contamination would move straight into runoff channels. It could reach town within hours. Workers scrambled away from the area. Someone shouted, "Shut it down!" Another yelled, "We can't. The override isn't responding." Nate's eyes shot to the control panel. The manual shutoff was blinking red, disabled remotely. Someone had locked the system. Someone who hadn't counted on him still being here. For one split second, Nate felt the old grief rise up Rachel's face in that hospital bed, Emma's little fingers around his thumb. As a newborn, the quiet promise he'd made in a dark hallway. Protect her. Always. He ran, straight into the danger zone. Nate. Stop. Kurt shouted from behind him. You don't have clearance. I don't need clearance, Nate yelled back. Heat radiated off the pipe. Pressure built with a violent hiss. He wrapped his sleeve around his hand, grabbed the emergency valve wheel and pulled. It didn't budge. The system had been jammed electronically. The hissing grew louder. A bulge swelled in the center of the pipe like a beating heart. A rupture was seconds away. Nate dropped to his knees and yanked open the lower access panel on the filtration manifold. He scanned the maze of wires and relay switches, his old world, the one he'd walked away from, but never truly forgot. There. One line spliced with a bypass chip installed recently sloppily by someone who had no business messing with industrial controls. Someone trying to force throughput far beyond safety limits. Someone covering their tracks. Nate ripped the chip free. Sparks flared. The red lights above him switched to yellow. The valve disengaged. He stood lunged for the wheel again and twisted with everything he had. It fought him. Metal groaned. The pipe shuddered so violently the whole floor vibrated. Then, finally, it began to turn. 1 revolution. 2. 3. The pressure gauge dropped like a falling stone. The pipe settled. The mist stopped. Silence. Then a burst of relieved shouting. Applause. A few workers dropped to their knees. Nate staggered back, breathing hard sweat dripping into his eyes. Kurt stood frozen nearby, staring at him like he was seeing him for the first time. Harper, you just saved half the county's water supply. But Nate wasn't celebrating yet. He was staring at the exposed panel, at the bypass chip in his hand, at the exact same model of device used to falsify safety logs. He looked up at the cameras mounted high in the corners. Some were still blinking green. Others were dark. The dark ones had always bothered him, but now they terrified him. Someone had disabled specific feeds. Someone inside the company. Someone who knew how to hide corruption behind the noise of a busy plant. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the control station. Vince, phone in hand, watching him, not with gratitude, but with fear. The kind of fear that comes from seeing your entire story fall apart. Nate straightened slowly. Vince met his gaze, face pale, then turned and slipped out the side door. Nate stared after him, knowing without a doubt that Vince was not the architect of this disaster. He was a pawn, a messenger, someone caught in a larger shadow. But someone higher up had just made a mistake. They had shown their hand. A supervisor approached cautiously. Nate, what did you just do? Nate held up the bypass chip. I just proved that somebody's been rigging this plant for months. A murmur rippled through the workers nearby. Someone whispered, he wasn't lying. Another said, he saved us. Saved everyone. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. The man they had been told was a problem, the man they were preparing to watch, escorted out, had just saved the entire plant and their families. A dozen eyes turned toward him with a mix of gratitude, awe, and quiet fear. Because if Nate was right, their company wasn't just cutting corners. It was hiding something much bigger. Nate closed the access panel, slipped the bypass chip into his pocket, and exhaled slowly. The crisis had passed, but the war had just begun. For a long moment, no one moved. The plant floor was still ringing with the ghost of alarms, but the only real sound was the drip, drip, drip of condensation sliding off the cooled pipe Nate had just saved from blowing apart. Workers stood frozen at a safe distance, their faces lit by the yellow emergency lights. A few of them looked shaken. A few looked grateful. Most looked stunned, like they were seeing a man they'd worked beside for years for the very first time. Zach was the one who finally broke the silence. He took 2 steps forward, eyes wide. How'd you know what to pull? I didn't even know that panel existed. Nate didn't answer. He was staring across the floor at the door Vince had slipped through. He could still feel the bypass chip in his pocket, warm from his grip, solid in a way that made his next move feel inevitable. Kurt approached slowly, holding his helmet under one arm. His voice was rough. Harper, nobody in this building, nobody with basic training could have done what you just did. Nate kept his gaze on the door. I did what needed to be done. Kurt shook his head. No, you did more than that. A small group of workers gathered behind him. Some of them exchanged uneasy looks, as if realizing the story they'd been fed these past few days didn't fit anymore. Someone whispered, he saved us. Another murmured, They tried to fire that guy. The shift in the air felt heavier than steam from the cooling pipes. Rumors were already rewriting themselves. The story was turning, pivoting, reshaping, and Nate could feel it happening. But he didn't care about any of that. Not yet. He pulled off his gloves, tucked them into his belt, and headed for the stairs. "Where are you going?" Kurt called. "To finish something," Nate said without looking back. He pushed through the exit door into the hallway. His boots echoed sharply on the polished concrete, each step flinting with purpose. He followed the path toward the administration wing, where the glass offices overlooked the factory floor like watchtowers. Halfway there, he heard footsteps behind him, quick, light ones. Zach jogged up beside him. "Nate, wait. If you go in there alone, I've been alone the whole time," Nate said quietly. "Doesn't change anything." Zach hesitated, then stopped following. He understood. Some battles had to be stepped into by yourself. Nate reached the hallway outside the supervisor offices. Through one of the windows, he spotted Vince pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly. When he caught sight of Nate through the glass, his face drained of color. He hung up and moved toward the door like he meant to block it. Nate stepped inside anyway. "Harper." "This isn't the time," Vince snapped, closing the door behind him. "We're already handling the situation. Engineering will be here in 10 minutes. "No, Vince." Nate said, voice steady. "You're not handling anything. You're covering it up." Vince stiffened. "Watch yourself. You put that bypass chip in." Nate reached into his pocket and held up the device between 2 fingers. "You wired the system to force output past safety limits. You created the exact failure you just watched me stop." Vince's jaw twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about. You've never touched an industrial relay system in your life," Nate said. "Your wiring was sloppy. Half the insulation was stripped. The pressure readings told me exactly where it would be." Vince swallowed hard. "You can't prove anything." "I can prove enough." Nate dropped the chip onto the desk where it clattered against a stack of falsified reports. "And whoever ordered you to do this, they're not as invisible as they think." Vince's gaze flickered fear-guilt, something darker. Nate stepped closer. "Who told you to override the safety protocols? I'm not telling you anything," Vince whispered. "You're going to tell someone," Nate said. "Because that leak wasn't an accident. It was a chain reaction caused by months of falsified data, hidden by someone with influence, someone who needed the numbers to look clean long enough to push something through." Vince's voice cracked. "You don't understand how deep this goes. Then help me understand." Before Vince could answer, another voice came from behind them. "He won't be telling you anything, Mr. Harper." Nate turned. The door to the hallway was now open. Standing there was a woman Nate had seen only from a distance. Always behind tinted glass, always surrounded by managers who cleared her path. Alyssa Grant, Regional Director for Clearwater Corporate. Her heels clicked as she stepped inside, closing the door with deliberate calm. She scanned the scene, the bypass chip, the papers, Vince's trembling hands, and exhaled softly. "Well," she said, "it seems we can no longer pretend we don't have a problem." Vince froze. "Ma'am, I wasn't..." She didn't even look at him. Her attention was locked on Nate. "You were supposed to be a simple maintenance supervisor," she said. "A man who kept his head down, a man who stayed in his lane." Nate said nothing. She walked closer, her voice low. "So imagine my surprise when I learned you used to be one of the state's top inspection engineers. Civil infrastructure, water quality, enforcement oversight." She tilted her head. "You didn't list any of that on your application." Nate's shoulders tensed. He hadn't wanted anyone to know. Not because he was hiding something shameful, but because losing that part of his life had almost broken him. He'd left that world behind after Rachel's death. After bills took the home they had saved for together. After a promotion he'd earned disappeared into budget cuts. After he'd found himself alone with a little girl and nothing left to give but exhaustion. "I wanted a fresh start," Nate finally said. "No," Alyssa corrected softly. "You wanted to disappear." Her words hit harder than he expected. Behind her, a small crowd of workers had gathered outside the glass Zach Kurt supervisor's line operators. Even the two corporate reps had arrived, confusion etched across their faces. Alyssa glanced toward them, then back to Nate. "Do you know why the board forced me to fly in this week? Because we've been receiving anonymous alerts about falsified safety data. Technical memos, precise breakdowns, detailed enough to indicate that someone with deep inspection experience was working inside the plant." She paused. "Those alerts came from your personal laptop." Nate closed his eyes. He hadn't wanted credit. He'd wanted help. He'd wanted anyone with real authority to see what was happening. Alyssa stepped closer. "You tried going through the proper whistleblower channels, but the system is slower than corruption." Vince lurched forward. He accessed restricted panels he caused. The enough. Alyssa snapped, turning on him. "I've seen the raw data. The failures didn't start with Mr. Harper. They started months before he even touched a valve." She gestured toward the bypass chip. "This was installed on your watch, Vince. You're either complicit or incompetent." Vince sagged against the wall. The last of his bluster drained away. Outside the office, whispers rippled through the crowd. "He was an inspector." "That explains it. No wonder he caught it." Alyssa faced Nate again. "You didn't just stop a dangerous breach today. You prevented an ecological disaster." Her voice lowered further. "And you exposed a criminal operation inside my region." The words struck like a hammer. Criminal. As in federal-level criminal. Nate swallowed. "So what happens now?" Alyssa looked toward the reps. "We're launching a full regional investigation, and I need someone who understands both the engineering systems and the stakes. Someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth." Nate stared at her, unsure where this was going. "I want you," Alyssa said quietly, "to lead an independent safety audit for every plant in the district. Temporary appointment, full authority, full access, salary to match your former state position." The room outside went silent. Workers pressed closer to the glass. Even the corporate reps stared stunned. Vince closed his eyes as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. Nate felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, but the weight of a crossroads he hadn't expected to reach. He thought of Emma, of her drawing, of the promise he'd made to her mother, of the life he'd been scraping together out of broken pieces. He looked Alyssa in the eyes. "Why me? Because you risked everything today for people who didn't believe you," she said. "And because this company needs someone who still remembers what integrity looks like." The weight settled deeper, but in a steadier way, a way that felt almost like purpose. Alyssa held out a folder. "You don't have to decide today, but you do need to know one thing." "What's that?" Nate asked. She turned slightly so the workers outside could hear her words too. "You're not the villain here, Mr. Harper," she said. "You're the only reason we still have a future to fix." A hush spread across the hall. Zach lifted his chin, pride replacing fear. Kurt bowed his head, humbled. Supervisors traded guilty glances. And Nate stood there not as a janitor, not as a scapegoat, but as the man who had just changed the trajectory of the entire plant. The folder in his hands was heavier than paper. Because this wasn't just a job offer. It was a turning point. A chance to rebuild something inside him that he thought had died the night Rachel did. A new role, a new fight, and a new responsibility he hadn't asked for, but maybe had been meant for all along. Alyssa gestured toward the plant floor below. The system failed these people. You didn't, so the question is simple. She looked him dead in the eyes. Are you ready to help me fix what's broken? Nate glanced through the glass at the workers watching him. The same people who'd doubted him, whispered about him, avoided him. They weren't avoiding him now. They were waiting. He took a slow breath. He didn't answer yet. But he knew this, whatever came next. He wouldn't be walking into it as the man they tried to bury. He'd be walking into it as the man who refused to let the truth stay silent. The plant stayed strangely quiet after Alyssa's announcement, as if the machinery itself was waiting to see what Nate would do. People stepped aside when he walked through the hall, not out of fear, but respect. Real earned respect. Supervisors who used to brush past him offered awkward nods. Line workers clapped him on the shoulder. Even Kurt, who had held on to company lines for too long, stopped him by the stairwell. I should have listened, he said, voice low. You deserved better than what we gave you. Nate didn't gloat. He just nodded. We all deserve better than what they've been doing. Vince wasn't there to hear any of it. He was escorted out of the building under corporate supervision before the shift ended. Rumors moved fast. Some said he'd cooperated. Others said he'd been the one to crack the moment Alyssa pressed him. Either way, the look on his face earlier told Nate everything some people crumble under the weight of their own silence. But the moment that hit hardest came when Nate walked out to the parking lot after everything wrapped up. Zach jogged after him, breathless. You changed everything today, the kid said. My mom drinks that water. My little brother does too. What you did, it mattered. Nate didn't have a good response for that. He just put a hand on Zach's shoulder, squeezed once, and headed home. When he stepped into the house, the smell of Emma's shampoo greeted him before she did. She ran down the hallway, socks sliding on the laminate floor, arms open wide. Daddy, you're home early. He crouched to catch her, lifting her into a hug he didn't realize he needed until her arms tightened around his neck. For the first time in days, he felt the knot in his chest loosen. Long day, he murmured. Did you fix the thing you said you had to fix? He pulled back enough to look into her eyes. Yeah, he whispered. I did. That night, after she fell asleep with her stuffed fox tucked under her chin, Nate sat on the edge of his bed and opened the folder Alyssa had handed him. The offer inside wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about climbing ladders or corporate status. It was about purpose, oversight, accountability, rebuilding trust in places that had forgotten what honesty looked like. It was exactly what Rachel used to tell him he was meant for. The decision wasn't hard. 3 weeks later, Nate walked back into Clearwater Processing, not as the man with a mop bucket, not as the scapegoat they tried to blame, but as the lead auditor for the entire district. His ID badge looked different now. His authority was different too. He started by opening every door that had been closed to him. He gathered teams, redirected protocols, shredded outdated policies, and wrote new ones in language that didn't leave room for shortcuts. And amazingly, people followed, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. The plant changed. Slowly then, all at once, supervisors began asking questions instead of burying them. Safety meetings weren't just paperwork drills. Workers spoke up. And the people who'd spent years staying quiet finally felt like they were allowed to care again. One afternoon, while Nate was reviewing the last of the old contamination logs, Alyssa stopped by his office. You found your place again, she said simply. He smiled, small, tired, proud. Feels like it. And your daughter? She asked. She's doing good. Sleeps easier lately, and I do too. Alyssa nodded, satisfied. Then we did something right. 6 months passed. Seasons turned. Clearwater Processing earned its first clean audit in years, real not manufactured. The story spread through the district. Other plants began requesting Nate personally. He became the guy they called when they wanted truth instead of excuses. Every time he walked into a plant, workers didn't look through him anymore. They looked to him. And at home, life grew gentler. Emma's drawings changed too. The sun got bigger. The grass got greener. Sometimes she'd draw him wearing a hard hat, sometimes wearing a cape just for fun. He saved every single picture. But the moment that told him he'd finally rebuilt something inside himself came on a quiet Sunday morning at the farmer's market. A woman pushing a stroller recognized him from the plant tour Alyssa had arranged for families. "You're the man who fixed the water," she said. "Thank you." Nate didn't know what to say. Gratitude from strangers wasn't something he'd ever been ready for. He just nodded and kept moving Emma's small hand wrapped around his. Later that day, as they sat on a bench near the river eating ice cream, Emma leaned her head against his arm. "Daddy," she said, "you look happy." He looked out at the water, at the people picnicking on the grass, at the little curls of wind rippling through the trees. "I think I am," he answered. She smiled like she'd been waiting to hear that for a long time. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always roar into the room. Sometimes it starts as one man refusing to sign a lie, one man pulling a dangerous chip from a panel, one man remembering a promise he made in a hospital hallway years ago. Sometimes it starts with a father who keeps showing up even when the world tells him he's small. And sometimes when the alarms are blaring, when the pressure rises, when everyone else steps back, that's exactly the kind of man who saves the day.